Normally I have to call the room to attention. Welcome to the Winthrop Rockefeller Institute. My name is Janet Harris. I'm the Executive Director and CEO here at the Institute. And on behalf of my team here on Petit Jean Mountain, it's my pleasure and honor to welcome all of you to the Winthrop Rockefeller Distinguished Lecture Series this morning. Thank you for making the trip up the mountain today. I know you'll agree with me, it's a beautiful drive, even if it's a long one, but there is something special about winding your way up Petit Jean and coming here to the Institute for these conversations that we're so pleased to host about topics that are important to Arkansas. Today, we are very fortunate to have a robust discussion around agricultural trade, and we have some of the foremost experts in that topic here with us today. And you're going to hear from all of them and be formally introduced to them later, but I do want to just start out by offering our special thanks to the United States Department of Agriculture Deputy Secretary Stephen Vaden, to Dr. Andrew Muhammad from the University of Tennessee Institute of Agriculture, and Ambassador Darcy Vetter, who have all joined us today. And you'll hear more about them and from them in just a few moments. I want to start by saying I know there's some of you who probably haven't been to the Institute before, and if it's your first time, welcome. If you've been many times, welcome back. This Institute and the Winthrop Rockefeller Distinguished Lecture Series would not be possible without the philanthropy of Governor Winthrop Rockefeller. The grandson of John D. Rockefeller Sr., Winthrop Rockefeller moved to Arkansas in 1953, and he fell in love with this state, with the promise and the possibility that it offered, and he dedicated the last 20 years of his life to not only public service, but to philanthropy and leadership. Many of his meetings and his initiatives took place right here on Petit Jean Mountain. And he was very interested, as most of you know, in agriculture, having built a cattle farm right here on top of Petit Jean Mountain. But he also built a conference center, which you're in today, to call people together to be thoughtfully concerned, to participate in the search for solutions to issues that are important to our state and to the world beyond. So it is our privilege and pleasure here at the Institute to continue Winthrop Rockefeller's collaborative approach to creating transformational change and to have conversations like this one. So thank you all for making the journey here and for being with us for this special event. You know, yesterday or last evening, we heard some remarks from a couple of our speakers, and Deputy Secretary Vaden was talking about how important it is for our voices to be heard with policymakers about any issue really, but particularly around the issues facing agriculture. And one of the things that he mentioned is that depending on where you are in the United States, you may run into people who don't know a farmer, who have never met a farmer. I'd say that's probably not true for us in Arkansas, because most of us either come from farm families or we know farm families. And certainly agriculture has been part of our state's rich heritage and lifeblood and impacted all of our lives. And so it is our privilege to get to have this conversation today and to support agriculture in Arkansas. It's our biggest industry and one of our most important, so it's our honor to do this. I want to offer just a few notes of thanks to folks who are in the audience today. The Winthrop Rockefeller Institute Board of Directors. We have our chair, Dr. Deborah Baldwin. Our vice chair, Dr. D.Q. Fields, is with us today, and Bob McEwen is here. So thank you so much to our board for being here to support us today. I also want to recognize President Jay Silveria of the University of Arkansas System. He has been a great supporter of not only the lecture series, but the Institute. We are a supporting organization of the University of Arkansas System and proud to be affiliated with the work that they do across 15 campuses and 6 different campus units. Also want to recognize our own Secretary of Agriculture, Wes Ward. Thank you, Mr. Secretary, for being with us today. And I know we have a couple of elected officials that had joined us last evening and possibly today. I'm looking in the audience. I don't know if you're out here, but State Senator Tyler Dees was here along with Representative Kendra Moore. So thanks to all of you, the elected officials, the industry leaders, everyone who showed up for this event. And my last, or I guess next to last, thank you is to a very important group of folks in the room, and that's students. We have students here from 3 different universities in Arkansas who are here to be thoughtfully concerned and to ask questions and to listen and learn. Most of them have majors in ag business, ag econ, and we look forward to you learning alongside of us and to the careers that you will have in Arkansas in the future. So thank you, students, for being here, and thank you to all the faculty who ushered them to the mountain and made this possible for them. Arkansas TV is broadcasting our event today, so they will be live streaming, and if the folks at home who are watching, we thank you for joining us. This will also be a recorded event that you can go back and watch, and so we hope all of you will share this widely with your networks and just help people learn more about what we are going to enjoy today. My last note is to thank the Winthrop Rockefeller Distinguished Lecture Series. Since 1972, they have been bringing outstanding lecturers to campuses across Arkansas to stimulate intellectual discussion and promote cultural advancement, and again, just help us all to learn from each other. And it's a privilege and pleasure to be able to work with the lecture series and to be able to host this event for them. And so at this time, I would like to recognize the chair of the Distinguished Lecture Series, Dr. Deborah Baldwin, for a few remarks and the introduction of our panel. Thank you.
Thank you, Janet, for asking me to do this, because I love being able and being privileged enough to chair both the Winthrop Rockefeller Institute Board and the Winthrop Rockefeller Distinguished Lecturer Board. I joked with some of you last night that I seem to be doing all things Rockefeller these last couple of years, but it's been a privilege to do so. And today, I have the pleasure of introducing our presenters. And their accomplishments are so renowned that I'm going to actually need to stick to some notes for this, because they've done a lot. I'm going to introduce first Dr. Andrew Muhammad. He is professor and Blazing Game Chair of Excellence in Agricultural Policy in the Department of Agricultural and Resource Economics at the University of Tennessee Institute of Agriculture. He brings considerable experience and research to the Blazing Game Chair position, focusing on assisting decision makers in evaluating opportunity, policies, and programs related to international trade. Dr. Muhammad previously served as the Associate Director at the Economic Research Service, ERS, an agency of the U.S. Department of Agriculture. He also served as Chief of the International Demand and Trade Branch at ERS, where he managed research, outreach, and data activities related to international trade and policy. Dr. Muhammad has authored 90 refereed journal articles and more than 70 reports and other publications. He has also served as an investigator on funded research and outreach activities totaling more than $6 million, including funding from the Gates Foundation, the National Institute of Food and Agriculture, and the National Science Foundation. His research focuses on agricultural trade, trade policy, and the economics of global food demand. He serves on several national advisory boards, including the Agricultural Policy Committee, which provides trade counsel to the Secretary of Agriculture and the U.S. trade representatives. Let's welcome Dr. Muhammad. And of course, our next presenter is Ambassador Darcy Vetter. Ambassador Darcy Vetter is a global public policy leader and trusted advisor working with companies, nonprofits, and international organizations at the intersection of agriculture, sustainability, and international trade. Ambassador Vetter's career spans more than 2 decades of policy leadership, including service as the Deputy U.S. Trade Representative for Agriculture and Undersecretary of Agriculture of Trade, and serving as the head of Global Public Policy for PepsiCo and the Nature Conservancy. Darcy served as Chief Agricultural Negotiator at the the Office of the U.S. Trade Representative, a Senate-confirmed presidential appointment. In this role, she negotiated the agricultural package of a 12-nation free trade agreement with countries in the Asia-Pacific, and completed agreements with Brazil, China, and other trading partners. As Deputy Undersecretary of the U.S. Department of Agriculture, she oversaw the Foreign Agricultural Service, working to expand market access for U.S. agricultural products worldwide, and directing USDA's capacity building and food assistance programs. Let's welcome Ambassador Vaden. And last but not least, our moderator, George Dunklin. George owns and operates Dunklin Farms in Arkansas County, where he founded and has managed the Five Oaks Duck Lodge since 1983. He is president of the Five Oaks Ag Research and Education Center, which he founded in 2020. He is a member of Governor Sarah Huckabee Sanders' Natural State Initiative and a founding member of the Arkansas Innovation Council, where he was appointed to serve by Governor Hutchinson in 2019. Dunklin is also a member of Ducks Unlimited and has served in numerous leadership positions in that organization for over 30 years. He currently serves on the Wetlands America Trust Board of Trustees. Dunklin is a former chairman of the Arkansas Game and Fish Commission, where he served from 2005 to 2012. Known for his dedication and service to conservation, Dunklin was named the 2009 Budweiser Conservationist of the Year. He has been inducted into the Arkansas Outdoor Hall of Fame and the Arkansas Waterfowl Hall of Fame. Let's thank our moderator and welcome him as well.
Thank you very much, Dr. Baldwin. Thank you for your leadership. Before I go any further, I want to echo what Janet Harris said about Governor Rockefeller and how fortunate we are in Arkansas that he chose us. Of all the 50 states, he came to Arkansas. But I want to recognize Will Rockefeller, his grandson, who just came into the room. Will, thank you for being here today. We appreciate your grandfather greatly. Panelists, this is a very distinguished group in the audience today. We have ag leaders from the banking industry, from our Secretary of Ag, Wes Ward, is here, to some of our largest farmers. We have representatives from our 2 largest rice mills or cooperatives here, producers in Riceland, among many others, and of course the students. So this is a great group of folks that we got here. We've got some questions that I'm going to ask that we prepared, but I'm going to leave the last 15 or 20 minutes for questions from the audience. So be thinking about questions that you always wanted to ask somebody that are high up in government or the expertise that we have here today. And any question's a good question. So please be thinking about that. Be mindful of that as we go through. Panelists, here in Arkansas, we're you probably know a lot of this, but Arkansas, agriculture is the leading industry in our state. That's why we got the group we have here today. That's why we're sitting on top of this mountain. Rice we're the #1 rice producer in this state. We're, I think, the #3 in cotton in this state. We're one of the largest poultries. In forestry, we have some 20 million acres in forestry. So we're very diversified in our ag. But right now, being in agriculture is not a whole lot of fun. If you're a banker, you're worried about getting your loans paid out. If you're a farmer, you're worried about making it to the next year. Markets have prices have gone down, as you know, and of course our cost of the production has gone way up. And so it's not a good time. Probably the worst I've seen it. I started farming in 1980, and so probably have to go back to the mid 80s to see something as bad as the shape we're in. What cure all wills is prices. We got to get markets open. So part of when Dr. D.Q. Fields and I were looking for a program to do, that's what we decided. Trade was probably the most important thing that we have. Opening markets up around the world. It's not just about free trade, it's about fair trade. And so we're looking for y'all for answers today to help us, to guide us, to understand the predicaments that we're in, but we're also looking for help from you folks. So with all that being said, let's get started. First question I have is, which emerging global markets represent the strongest growth opportunities for Arkansas commodities, say over the next 5 to 10 years? And how can expanding those exports help counter recent U.S. agriculture trade deficits? Ambassador, we'll start with you.
Start with me? Maybe. There we go. Well, before I jump in on the question, I do just want to say thank you to the Winthrop Rockefeller Institute for having me and for hosting this at such a beautiful place, my first time to the top of the mountain. And I want to take a minute, especially to talk to the students in the audience. I'm so glad that you are here. You're going to listen to a conversation this morning about some big challenges that we face and challenges that the public and the private sector need to address together. And so would just encourage you, as you think about all the skills that you are gaining, the opportunity for public service as a way to use those skills. Whether you are a communicator or a lawyer or an economist, an animal scientist, all of those skills are things that are needed in public service. And I can attest, as Andrew can as well, to the fact that there are a lot of rewarding careers out there to serve your country in that way. So that was my soapbox for a minute, but I hope that you will consider it. You know, I think there are, when you look at U.S. agriculture and the variety of things that we export, even the variety just looking in Arkansas itself, there's kind of a combination of trade that you want to have, right? With more established markets that maybe buy, and higher value markets that maybe buy things that are on that higher value end of the supply chain. More expensive cuts of meat. They might buy fancy cheese. It could be, you know, all of those things, all of which the U.S. makes. And then there are multiple emerging markets that maybe now are our customers for powdered milk or just, or soybeans or corn or, you know, basic grains, but maybe moving up that chain and where we want to establish strong relationships as being a reliable supplier. And a supplier of things that are on time and on spec, and you know, with good logistics. And those are things that in the past, the U.S. has been able to sort of set itself apart from some of our competitors. And so certainly if you look to Southeast Asia, that is an area where you have multiple countries that are already good customers, that have growing populations and growing incomes at the same time, where we can send them raw commodities now, but where their appetite for a broader variety of high-value ag products continues to grow. It is an area, however, that also has continued to complete trade agreements and is broadly shopping with our competitors who supply both those things on the commodity side, but also some of those higher value products. And so we're not the only ones, I think, that are looking to that territory as that real growth potential. And so, you know, the strength of those relationships now, I think, is important for the U.S. To focus on for the health of that relationship later.
Thank you.
Yes, I'll sort of start with the last part of the question and then get into some commodities and sort of emerging destinations for both sort of U.S. agriculture overall, as well as within the South, as well as the state. But I do want to first thank the Winthrop Rockefeller Foundation for this invitation. And I also am happy to also see so many students in the audience. This is a tremendous opportunity, and I look forward to working with all of you one day and helping to sort of shape and to make agricultural exports great again. All right, so let's take the last part. And the last part of this question is about trade deficits. And at one point, we actually had an agricultural trade surplus. We exported far more ag to the world than we imported, and that's obviously is flipped within the last couple of years. So this recent year, I think the trade deficit in ag was around $41 billion. And the real question is, should we think about this as a problem as we move forward? Right? That's something for us to really sort of drill deep down into, sort of what causes sort of agricultural trade deficits, why, and is it necessarily a problem? And why I raise that point is this. Secretary Perdue, under the previous Trump administration, could say, when we had an agricultural trade surplus, we are not part of the problem, do no harm to agriculture. But now Secretary Rollins, obviously, she does not have that sort of as some moral high ground to say. But here's what I caution everyone when we speak about agricultural trade deficits. That let's not think about this in the context of deficits. Let's think about this in the context of growing U.S. agricultural exports. Because you can shrink deficits without benefiting the ag sector on the export side. Now, and I'll explain. The most recent U.S. agricultural trade outlook has both imports and exports falling, but it has imports falling at a greater rate, and therefore you see a smaller deficit. But yet and still, when you present it as sort of we're going to shrink the deficit, you hide the fact that agriculture could actually be worse off in terms of export sales. So I do want to say, let's think about different language when we think about U.S. agricultural trade. And then the other part is we import things that we just simply don't produce. And we're satisfying a demand that we simply can't satisfy on our own. And we simply have to make peace with that. All right, so let's just sort of think about emerging markets and things we've seen. And one of these sort of, one phenomenon is going to actually require that we're going to have to make our peace with China, whether it be export sales to China or export sales to something else. And let me give you to somewhere else. So at one point in time, Chinese wages were real low. Now Chinese wages are higher. A lot of manufacturers in China, whether it's textile manufacturers, as well as furniture and flooring manufacturers, have decided to move to Southeast Asian countries. So we're talking about Chinese-owned companies, but just in other parts of the world. And so now we're seeing increase in exports of cotton to Southeast Asia, and Southeast Asia will continue to grow as a manufacturing hub, as a place where we can actually ship more cotton as well as forestry products for their manufacturing sector. But some of that is still going to be Chinese-owned. And in fact, I think the Chinese actually bought a furniture manufacturing plant in Mexico, because one could sort of then expect now increase in export sales of, say, forestry products to that region. When it comes to sort of high value-added food products, and Darcy's 100% correct, the ASEAN region, Southeast Asia, seems to be thriving. But here's where I would say we should invest. The Chinese have done it for quite some time, and Europeans have been there just due to colonial ties. We really do need to think about sub-Saharan Africa and try to get in that market quite early. It's not so good to allow a market to grow then to try to step in. So there's an emerging middle class there, a very, very young economies throughout sub-Saharan Africa, potential demand, and I really do think both here within the state, but as well as sort of broader national initiatives, we need to invest more in that region in terms of export promotion and future sales.
The next question we have is, how can federal and state leaders influence future trade agreements or regulatory frameworks to improve market access for Arkansas farmers while reducing long-term agriculture trade deficits? Darcy?
So I think whether it's federal or state leaders or whether it's farmers using their voice through trade associations, through your land-grant universities, I think sort of making your voices heard in a number of ways are important. And on a very practical side of things, remember that as much analysis that your government leaders have about where trade flows have the opportunity to go, how we could change tariff rates, where there is opportunity. We are not, and I say this as someone who negotiated trade agreements for about 15 years, we aren't sitting in your shoes. And so we don't always see how some of those changes in the terms of trade have ripple effects back to you. And I think that's particularly important right now when we look at not only changes in the terms of trade, but how rapidly those things are changing and what that means on the farm for uncertainty. And I'll share just an anecdote that when I left government in early 2017, I was then working with the U.S. Grains Council. And I was helping them at the time think about what's a strategy for China, for U.S. corn and sorghum, like looking 10 years from now? How should we think about some of these things? But while I was working on that project with them, that was during the first Trump administration, the president raised a question, should NAFTA continue? Maybe I might pull out of NAFTA. And, what does that mean? Should we renegotiate those terms of trade? And up here, that looked like a diplomacy question. But the phone started ringing immediately because the uncertainty that caused about what the tariff treatment would be for farmers in my home state of Nebraska who were trying to sell their corn south, it meant suddenly that the 90-day credit terms they usually had to make that corn sale happen were shortened to 30. And the basis cost of who would handle that shipping and how would they transfer that, suddenly the transaction cost of doing business when the terms at the border were unclear got a whole lot more expensive really quickly. That's not the reality that negotiators live in. Our job, and I thought of it as my job when I was the chief ag negotiator, was to help U.S. farmers sell as many things to as many places in as many forms and understand that the market was open and transparent and consistent for them to be able to make the investments to do so in the long term. And so, I think part of the way that you can participate and influence both the substance and the pace and the priority of negotiations is to talk about what those terms of trade will look like for your choices on the farm and how those changes kind of back up into your cost of doing business, your options for sale, whether the infrastructure exists for you to be able to access a new market or how long that might take. All those things I think are really important for negotiators to know who sometimes live in that big picture, but we need to understand the minutia as well.
I guess something that's interesting from the perspective of economic research focused on international trade policy, and when we make these forecasts about the implications of certain agreements on particular sectors, just as researchers and economists, I often remind us we really do need to understand that these are policies that affect flesh and blood people, right? It's not simply just about sort of an increase in a dollar or export sales to a particular destination. It's about the individual farmers who sell these products. And I think one of the things that we could do as a community is to communicate the actual stories, right? The stories of individuals who engage global markets, the story of how we engage our producer group and industry organizations. And one of the things that they have been particularly good at, just sort of sitting on the Agricultural Policy Advisory Committee, and that is communicating detailed issues affecting sectors. Right? It's not uncommon to hear someone speak about a particular policy in a destination market that's inhibiting U.S. agricultural exports. Right? That's not an uncommon thing. There's some things we still need to work out, but I do think it's the communication of those stories. The other thing, and I do find, just as a trade economist, it's easy for farmers to feel so far removed from global markets that they don't realize the impacts and implications of global trade, right? So 80% of the cotton we produce gets exported. So anything that happens in global cotton markets will affect farmers in Arkansas and will affect farmers in Tennessee. And I think that's what's clear there. So we need the individual stories coupled with the policy to help make policies effective. Well, at the same time, I think we need to be much more humanistic about how we think about sort of the negative impacts. So as an economist, I often think about sort of just the necessary consequences of trade, right? And I sort of just gloss over the fact that there are lost jobs in certain communities. Not me personally, but that's sort of the nature of the profession, to say the overall impacts are positive despite some negative implications here and there. And I do think we need to think about both the winners and losers in all aspects of trade policy, and all of that needs to be communicated to DC.
Next question is, share with us the complexities and challenges of negotiating multinational trade agreements like the Trans-Pacific Partnership, and some of the pros and cons between multinational and bilateral approaches to trade deals. Is there a political will to revisit multinational agreements?
So comprehensive free trade agreements are big, complicated, complex beasts, and they take a very long time to negotiate. But because they are comprehensive, you're really looking at a long-term agreement between countries to look at how they will further integrate their markets, give each other preferential treatment from the rest of the world, and provide each other an atmosphere for doing business, I guess a context for that also is deepened and preferential between them. So when I was negotiating TPP, again, 12-country deal, and there, of course, was this big agricultural chapter, which covered tariffs on every agricultural product in the tariff schedule, also commitments on sanitary and phytosanitary rules, so those animal and plant health measures, which we know can sometimes facilitate and sometimes really make trade a lot more difficult, how we would coordinate access and make sure that we were being transparent and following rules, and while also protecting food safety and our animal herds and our crops at the same time. So those were sort of the agricultural provisions. But there were also deep commitments around transparency. And we take for granted in the United States the opportunity to read draft regulations, to provide comment on them, to sit on these advisory committees that Andrew has just mentioned. That's not true in many countries, right? There's not that opportunity. And so we use our trade agreements, or we have in the past, to also open up those processes so that farmers and others can anticipate what's coming, can comment on what that might mean for trade. We focus on protecting intellectual property so that proprietary plant varieties or biotechnology or other things might be protected, so that if you make investments or you go to those new markets, you're not risking some of that investment you've made in developing those new technologies. So when I say a comprehensive free trade agreement, that's the kind of thing we mean. And of course, it covers not just agriculture, but the rest of our trade in goods and services. It gets really complex because it's a lot of issues. And so those deals take multiple years, sometimes multiple years with just one partner. When you have 12 partners that are all looking at opening up that trade to each other, of course, the level of complexity rises. And every one of those partners has hard politics. And I think as a negotiator, a more senior negotiator to myself, who also was a mentor to me, Wendy Cutler, said, the biggest mistake you can make as a negotiator in some of these really hard calls is to think that your politics are more important than your neighbors are. Because, of course, if we can't get over ours and they can't get over theirs, then the deal isn't done, or they can't implement it, right? And so it's both. What's great about being a trade negotiator and really frustrating is, on the one hand, you're using your left brain and you're doing the math, right? You're figuring out, is it more important that I get the tariff down on chicken leg quarters or on chicken breasts, right? Which one are we going to sell more of to this market more quickly, and what speed should they go? And the tariff on wheat versus rice, and you have to understand the market, our capability, supply, demand, and play the numbers, things that Andrew does every day. But on the other side of that is the story, right? And how much can their political environment, can their farmers absorb? What time period will it take for their own agriculture to adjust to these, changing trade flows? And I think what's important about those long-term agreements, they were politically hard. They took a really long time, but they were focused on the implementation itself. And sometimes, as a negotiator, you realize that you could get more. And you think, especially when you're first starting out, I used to think, oh, this person across the table, they're not very prepared. They haven't negotiated with the US before. They don't know all the numbers we have and the information they have, and I could really get this if I wanted to. And you think that's good. And then you realize what you really want is somebody who's very prepared across the table, because they understand the implications of what they are agreeing to. And you both know how it will be implemented. Because if we get a great deal, on paper, a deal, but that deal decimates their farmers, it has hugely negative, impacts, it's not politically saleable, then when we go to implement, the trade doesn't flow. And they don't live up to their part of the deal. And then you have a real mess. And that, what I said earlier, what you want is certainty. You want to be confident that the term on paper is the term that you're going to receive. And so taking the time to really figure out and to craft a deal that's about orderly implementation and long-term success is really important then to the users of that agreement, not to what's on paper. And I think the approach that we're taking right now, which is about speed and is often about leverage, that's a word I think you hear a lot more in trade policy lately, is we want to use the leverage of these reciprocal tariffs to get at some longstanding problems. And there have been some wins, right? Some kind of nasty trade barriers that we've seen movement on to say, if you don't move on them, this tariff I've imposed can't come down. But I think the question is, if you negotiate that really quickly, if you negotiate it using that short-term leverage, is it long-term implementable? Is it long-term? Does it have buy-in from both sides? And without the rest of the structure of these agreements, these shorter transactional deals, is there a mechanism to work through if there's a misunderstanding about the terms of the deal? There's no dispute settlement mechanism. If there's not the same commitment to participation in new regulations, in being transparent, in resolving longer term problems, will speed come by sacrificing certainty and longevity? And I think that's a real question for me of this bilateral versus sort of the more comprehensive and multilateral approach.
Thank you.
So I guess this is probably the point where I'm going to sound a bit preachy, all right? When I went to school, large-scale trade agreements was sort of the order of the day. Right? So I was in the PhD program in the 90s and finished in 99, 2000, and it was all about the World Trade Organization. We had just formed from the GATT this broad trade initiative, right, that encompassed for the first time agricultural sectors both in developing countries as well as the developed world. And we decided, just sort of as a global community, that we're going to reduce trade barriers on agricultural products. Obviously, we had some exemptions, some exceptions, but that was the spirit of the time. Now, one of the things about trade agreements, and even the ones that we negotiate bilaterally, that they were negotiated through Congress and codified into law, which means there's a permanence to them, there's an expectancy, and the business communities around the globe can say, here's what we know we would face every year in terms of policy, all right? And that consistency helped to grow agricultural exports. I'd be the first to say that booming period of agricultural trade surplus has had a lot to do with trade agreements. Now we've seemed to have moved into this new world of sort of agreements by executive order, which means the next president can decide, I'm not doing this. And everybody in the business community realizes that there's just a certain sort of non-permanent aspect to many of these. Some have been good. Like I think the agreement with Japan is technically an executive order type agreement, but it's not codified in the law, right? And then let's think about one last thing here. So if we think about NAFTA and trace it all the way back, right? The sort of the cooperation with Canada started under President Reagan. It sort of encompassed all of North America under President Bush, and then obviously passed and codified into law under Bill Clinton. You think of all the Obama era trade agreements. Most of those trade agreements started under President Bush, right? So we had a period where it did not matter if the trade agreement was implemented and started by the previous party. There was this understanding that the next party would help to sort of implement these agreements, get them passed, and to codify them into law. We had something that was also very consistent, believe it or not, and that is large Republican support for free trade agreements. In fact, we wouldn't even have free trade agreements were it not for sort of majority Republican support under both Democratic presidents as well as Republican presidents. Why am I making this point? That now that we've moved to sort of a less sort of multilateral, less cooperative approach, and President Trump is not sort of the only one. President Biden also had these kind of one-off sort of trade arrangements. And in fact, his trade arrangements didn't even include sort of market access. So this is not about a criticism of one party versus the other. This is about this idea of how do we see trade engagement moving forward. And I really do think we need to get back to sort of these codified agreements in law and not these sort of one-off negotiations through executive order, just for the consistency and the permanence that's needed there. And so I'll close with this point. Like, in my opinion, I think what the Supreme Court did was a good thing. And some may disagree, but the point I'm saying here is it's good in this respect, that it's saying, Congress, do your job and be what the Constitution has designated you to be, the arbitrator of trade agreements. And therefore, we can then sort of look forward to whatever good trade policies we implement, that some next administration won't step in and decide, well, that was that guy and not me, where they'd have to go through the full legal process to make for the fundamental change. And international trade needs that consistency. Businesses will tell you that, and as farmers, you all see that now, that inconsistency can have huge negative impacts on export sales. Right.
Wow. Thank you both. That was excellent. Next question. What is the role of federal trade policy, and how does it translate into real-world impacts on individual farms in states such as Arkansas, or it could be Nebraska, or Tennessee, where y'all are from? And how can this be influenced at the state level?
Well, I think similar to your earlier question about how do you use your voice, right? That voice, I think, is used to influence that federal policy. Let me just say that I think we have fixated almost on the tariff, right? Yeah. It's the favorite word, I think, of our current commander-in-chief, right? Like that is the mechanism of choice that is used for a number of things, from foreign policy to trade policy to economic and revenue collection, right? So that word has been front and center and on, at the headlines all the time. And certainly that sort of at the border tax on products coming to us, where we've imposed a lot of tariffs, farmers are feeling it right now. If you look at fertilizer, even though some of those have been brought down, steel and aluminum tariffs, your parts for your equipment are more expensive. Lumber and lumber products. Well, Arkansas is exporting a lot of those things, but they are actually inputs in a lot of the things that you're bringing in, cabinetry to build homes. The expansive application of tariffs on some of those core products that are imported by people who make other things means that the cost of manufacturing, of farming, of further economic activity is going up. And so those tariffs really do matter. And of course, then you see some retaliatory action or tariffs against, US products as well when we take unilateral action on others' products. And agriculture products are usually the first in line for that because our trading partners know that the agriculture sector is most dependent on exports. It's one of those sectors where we lead with that. And so at the moment, we have a federal trade policy that is focused on correcting trade deficits and using deficits as the barometer of whether the trade relationship is healthy or fair. I would echo Andrew's comments that I'm not sure, particularly in agriculture, whether that is the right barometer and whether measuring it with each country individually is a good assessment of whether countries are being fair versus looking overall at maybe what our trade balance is and where we are seeing opportunity to bring some manufacturing home, which I don't necessarily disagree with, right? And particularly for some sectors, you want to have core manufacturing in the United States for issues of national security. You want to be able to drive careers in advanced manufacturing. You want to make sure we have access to critical minerals that are an important foundation of our future technology. So I think some of those goals are right. Applying them and applying that metric bilaterally, I think can lead us to situations that maybe are more trade restrictive than they need to be. But I would also say, to go back to the beginning of your question on how does federal trade policy really affect economies, Andrew referred earlier to the World Trade Organization as sort of the network of agreements and international institutions that help guide how trade works. And so when I think about trade policy, I think about tariffs as one element of that policy, but just important are the network of international standards and international rules around how things like meat and poultry and grains and things move in a way that we're sure will protect plant and animal health here. We'll make sure that food that may come into the US from another country is safe to eat, and the same, of course, in other countries. And the United States used to really be a leading voice at the table at those institutions that developed those standards. And we're still there and participating. But the United States left the World Health Organization. It is asking a lot of questions about what its relationship should be with the Food and Agriculture Organization. Those are the two parent organizations of the Codex Alimentarius, which has a fancy name, but really just sets food safety standards around the globe. And other countries use those standards. They rely on the international standard to determine whether ag products are coming in or out, right? The same with our International Plant Protection Convention and the World Animal Health Organization. Those all require scientists from many different countries to come together at the table, recognize international sound science and practices, and agree upon standards that will both facilitate trade, but also make sure we're protecting our core agricultural assets. And so that trade system we sort of take for granted really takes a lot of care and nurturing. And the United States has been one of those countries that provides that nurture for a long time. And so that's another thing that I think states can do, which is to watch those processes, share your support for those processes, share when those processes may not be working, when we need new standards for new technologies or we're seeing pressure from new diseases, and make sure that the expertise you have at state level can be part of that conversation.
I know time is short, so I'll just sort of highlight 2 points. And Darcy mentioned retaliation. And there's 2 types of retaliation that I'd like to just sort of highlight real quickly. So we've seen retaliatory tariffs against U.S. agricultural products, obviously in retaliation against the administration's policies, but we've also seen implicit retaliation, and it seems to be much more damaging than actual retaliation. So right now, China has refused to reinstate licenses for the majority of beef exporting facilities in the United States. And so what did we see? That beef exports from the U.S. to China, right, was sort of our 3rd largest destination market, well over $10 billion. right up there with Japan and South Korea, and that's pretty much dropped to almost zero. Right. As a result of this retaliation, obviously we're talking about the period after March, or when the sort of not the first quarter, but when you look at trade in that way, the other thing that's important to my state, I mean, we're still trying to sort of figure this one out, is that the Canadians didn't take too well to being invited to be the 51st state, and decided no more California wine on the shelves, no more Tennessee whiskey on the shelves, no more Kentucky bourbon. They had a tariff, and that tariff then even got removed. But each province now gets to decide, should we put American products back on the shelf? All right, and so my point is that a lot of federal action has real impacts at the state level, and we have to actually communicate, whether it both be positive or negative. We have to continue to communicate that up the chain, whether it's through our state representatives, to our national representatives, through producer groups. I will always say the regional and state level associations are very connected to the national associations. And if they're not, they should be. And that's where a lot of information needs to get communicated up the chain, because this administration, as well as others, right, they need to hear the stories of the negative impacts. And without those stories, you don't really get the significant change in policies that we need.
Another question. Give us your perspective on the enforcement of the WTO, the World Trade Organization's agreement on subsidies and countervailing measures. Does the WTO remain an effective framework for managing ag trade disputes, or is a broader rethinking of global trade governance needed? What reforms would you prioritize?
That is not a question for just a couple of minutes, but let me just, so I know certainly in a state full of cotton producers, right, who are quite familiar with the cotton case against the United States, which looked at, the disciplining, the subsidies that we provided and changes that had to be made from those programs. The thought about payments to farmers and whether they are aligned with our WTO commitments, we know that can have consequences. I think the time that we're living in, I'm not sure that's the most pressing question. I mean, first of all, the United States, and not alone, but the loudest voice, has raised real questions about the WTO's dispute settlement body, whether it has overreached in some of its rulings and has effectively blocked the completion of the panel of arbitrators in that body, and so it's not really functioning at the moment. Excuse me. But more importantly than that, the United States is currently raising whether kind of WTO 101, the fundamental rule of most favored nation treatment, is appropriate for the WTO to do. And what MFN, as the trade nerds call it, is it simply says if you have a tariff on beef that's 5%, that tariff applies equally to every country in the world. They know what they're going to pay if they're sending that product to your country. Obviously, the policy we are now following of reciprocal tariffs and separate rates for each country directly contradicts that binding tariff schedule we have in Geneva at the WTO by imposing tariffs well above what we committed to and imposing different tariffs on different countries, regardless of product, right? So the test for the WTO's relevance and where it should be focusing and whether its current agreements are up to date with the challenges that we face in trade, I think is a really big one and goes well beyond the subsidies and countervailing measures agreement. And I think this is a huge sort of moment for us to figure out what do we need out of the WTO. Is it focused on the right things? Should it be focused on looking at the impact of subsidies that encourage different types of farming activity, that align incentives around more sustainable practices rather than simply looking at all subsidies as being equal? But I would argue that before we even worry about that, let's look at our own farm bill. I have had more conversations in the past 12 to 18 months with the biggest, most successful farmers, 70,000 acres, huge investments, and with farmers like my families who are, 280 organic acres in Nebraska. And both will say, you know what, crop insurance, it's not doing it for me right now, right? In some ways, it's a lot of money, it's a lot of government investment, and in order to sort of maximize the way my banker wants me to, my coverage, I kind of can't do some innovative things I'd like to do. And I'm hearing the same thing on the other side, right? And so that, if you're a smaller producer and you aren't just growing the 5 program crops, maybe you don't even have insurance that will protect you in a way or help you manage risk, right? And so I think a domestic rethink of what are the ag practices, the products, the risk management that we want to encourage is probably a more important place to start. And then to look and say, how can we have a global trade system that also can reflect the kinds of incentives that help farmers kind of farm to the market, to take advantage of those opportunities, and to think about serving local, regional, and global markets. But I might not start with the SCM agreement in Geneva.
I'd say that we've sort of have done a job in weakening the power of the WTO in terms of negotiating trade disputes. But I do think there was an issue with the WTO that we probably didn't think about in 1995. And that is the developing countries that had special and differential treatment would actually rise up to be powerhouses, particularly in the case of agriculture. And so the WTO was set up to allow developing countries to have more protective policies, to actually have a higher level of domestic support. And it was understood that these are developing economies and they're trying to make their way, and they can't compete with the European Union, the United States, Australia, and other major exporters. Right? But then you get, say, the rise of India, developing country status in the 90s. But now that it's such a large country and you still have these huge agricultural subsidies, the WTO wasn't designed to figure that one out, right? Sort of how do we then rein in a country that's emerged and to sort of get them to step back in supporting their agricultural production. So that was, so I get why there was such concern there. I heard a lot of people complain about sort of agricultural subsidies in India, for example. Then there are just certain policies on the input side where we send it to sort of subsidize agricultural prices, now indirectly through this sort of base acre type policy, which is separate and decoupled from production. But on the input side, I don't think the WTO was all that good about sort of managing that. But then here's the last thing I'll say, though, that when we won cases in the WTO, it seemed to be a perfectly working organization. I recall 2 cases at the same time, Boeing, European Union's case against Boeing, and then we had a case against Airbus. We won and they won. And obviously the narrative was the WTO got it right on our side, but got it wrong against Boeing, right? That's just sort of the nature of what it means to win and lose WTO cases. I'm sure that quite a few people who believe that the WTO got it right with the Brazilian cotton case. I was actually on the other side of the country of origin labeling case, which was dealing with beef products mostly. But you know what was interesting about that case? American producers sided with the Canadians, saying that country of origin labeling led to increased segregation costs. There's a lot of people who were upset about that case, but quite a few people in the United States were not. I've met American lawyers who've actually represented the foreign countries and the foreign entities in WTO cases. All right, this is just sort of a complicated process that I just marvel over. But the one thing I will say, that it did represent a body. It represented a body when it was active that we would go to as well as foreign countries. And we've effectively weakened that. And if I had to say anything as advice, that if we were going to sort of weaken the WTO, we probably should have thought harder about the Trans-Pacific Partnership, because it was meant to also be a multilateral body that would handle disputes. And we no longer seem to have that. And it's each country being able to do the thing that it wants. And that does not make for a good global trading system, in my opinion.
Janet, we'd like to open up to the audience. Do we have a mic that we can take around? Yeah. Okay. We have a question here. Ben Noble has a question. Do we have a mic that we can take to Ben? Ben's coming right behind you. There you go. This is Ben Noble, COO of Weissman Credits.
Oh, please, just let me talk.
Okay.
Thank you all very much. Just this week, the Trump administration filed a challenge to India at the WTO that they were over-subsidizing their rice production. That's very welcome to us. We've been saying that for years. And as y'all have said, the WTO is a little bit weakened these days, so we're not sure what comes out of that. I guess we're also taking some hope from the announcement from USTR Ambassador Greer that they're going to also look at Section 301 investigations on behalf of certain commodities, rice included. If that investigation does move forward, with y'all's experience, what are the tools that the administration has per the 301 findings that India and others are actually doing something wrong? What should we expect to come out of a 301 investigation or be pushing for? Thank you.
I'll just say this. The one thing about international rules and even sort of our internal investigations, these are sort of handshake agreements and sort of general sort of acceptances of rules and policies. There's no real legal enforcement, right? So even when we won WTO cases, what it simply allowed us to do is to impose tariffs on whatever sector that we chose up to the point of whatever the WTO estimated damages were, right? It doesn't sort of require the company or the country to change. It only simply allows us to retaliate. Now, so we have a body in place that allows retaliation, but we already have an administration that's sort of perfectly fine with imposing trade barriers, right? That's the only thing the WTO necessarily allows. But then let's even take this 301 investigation. In the end, what's going to happen is a recommendation for tariffs, right? The 301 investigation is a means by which to sort of override the tariffs that were struck down under IEEPA by the Supreme Court, right? I'm not saying anything, not passing any opinion about the goodness or the rightness or correctness of it. Just meaning that it's a means by which it allows the president to impose tariffs. And so I'm almost sure the finding is going to come out in favor of imposing tariffs, and that's going to be the thing that takes place. And clearly under 301, that it's not sort of subject to whatever the constitutional issues are, because 301 does allow the president to impose tariffs. As far as WTO cases, I don't know if we're going to see any findings anytime soon. I don't know if they could adjudicate anything right now. But the point is, even if we won, it would still be retaliation, as opposed to sort of, we would have to negotiate a trade agreement with India that encompassed everything in order to get them to rein in on certain agricultural support and subsidies that we find damaging. And you're not going to get that through sort of these executive order handshake type agreements, in my opinion.
I would disagree with that a little bit, in that I think that we're not the only ones that are concerned about India's over-subsidization practices. And, India, for its domestic politics, tends to set price floors for farmers and then subsidies for consumers to try and, keep on the good side, right? They want farmers' pockets to be full. They want consumers to not pay too much for bread. We know they do this with a variety of products, and what often happens is they then end up with public stock holdings that are very large, and they dump them on world markets. And that obviously is bad for our rice producers if they're trying to sell to third countries. So again, a tariff on Indian rice coming to the US, I'm not sure that really helps that much. What we're really worried about is what happens in third countries where we may be competing with rice that's being, kind of dumped at the last minute, right? But Pakistan cares a lot about that too, right? So there are other countries that are being undercut, some of India's neighbors. And so if it's the US that has the resources to be able to document, which is hard to do, and we were investigating it when I was chief ag negotiator as well, how much is India spending? How much are they subsidizing over the rate that they said they would be limited to in the WTO? Sometimes the United States can bring the transparency and bring the case that starts a process that others can work with us to finish, right? Because they're also being damaged by these things. So even if the appellate body at the WTO is not working, the sunshine that this case might shine on India's practices, I think, can be helpful for global pressure. And, and frankly, I think it's good that the United States is also leaning into that institution a little bit at a time when it's also kind of raising real pressure and questioning its credibility, right? So that kind of gives me some hope that we're going to stay engaged. The 301 process, I think, is different altogether. The USTR has been very clear that they are looking to use 301, which they know they have the constitutional ability to use, to replicate, and that's the word, we're going to replicate the regime we imposed under the IEEPA tariffs that were struck down by the Supreme Court. And so you see these two broad investigations into, and 301 is designed to sort of ferret out unfair trade practices, very broadly defined, and then to suggest remedies that would counter that lack of fairness. And rice was on the list, other export-oriented ag products were on the list, and I think you're going to see really expedited investigations because the temporary tariffs that were imposed only last till July 24, and the United States has started making deals with other countries on the basis that it could use these tariffs as leverage for them, right? So they don't want to see any break in their ability to impose those tariffs, so they want to quickly do 301 investigations, quickly make a determination that tariffs are warranted, and have those tariffs in place to close those deals with those countries that they've been making, these bilateral deals. So I think you're going to see that, and I think they're going to focus on rice because it's an issue that has been raised to them, and we know, frankly, our rice farmers are hurting, right? But what concerns me more about these 301 investigations, and I think should concern everyone in agriculture, is that the first set of investigations on multiple countries, the reason or the unfairness is defined as overcapacity. And that is that countries are producing more than they consume, and that if they are dumping that, pushing that overcapacity onto global markets, it might be unfairly competing with US exports. And so we think overcapacity equals unfairness or, an unfair trade practice. If the calculation is that simple, what sector of US agriculture is not unfair if our trading partners use the same calculus? And so, it worries me that they have limited these 301s to manufacturing. They're talking about building up manufacturing capacity and exporting it. And, they've tried to define it very carefully, but it doesn't take much creativity to see how others could use similar tools to say, the US grows a lot of soybeans. They're exporting a lot of poultry. And I think they're doing it to undercut my exports to this third country. And so maybe I need a 301. We have a competitive agricultural sector in part because we have geography that's on our side, because of strategic investments that have been made. And frankly, I don't think the rest of the world actually wants us to only produce what we can consume here. There are many countries that are quite import dependent, that don't have the land and the capability that we do. And so, I look at the current justification for this 301s broadly applied in a way they've not been used before, and hope that our trading partners don't get inspired to do the same.
Thank you both. Got one more question here, and then we'll have to break.
I'm going to speak into Kimberly's mic here. Thank you very much for being here. I really appreciate it. Dr. Muhammad, I have a question for you. First of all, it's good to see a fellow Tennessee volunteer out here in Arkansas. But Brazil is expected to have a record chicken meat export in 2026. In markets like the Philippines or Mexico, how confident can we be through demand modeling specifically, or just confidence in general, of the stickiness or confidence in that market share when Brazil undercuts us on price?
All right, so not just the poultry sector, that Brazil has become this agricultural powerhouse in quite a few sectors. Leading in beef, they've started about 6 years ago, surpassing us in soybeans, and that gap has widened. They've even overtaken us in the last 2 years in cotton. I don't know how we compete with triple cropping systems and double cropping systems and sort of yield rates that are significantly higher than ours for some sectors. But you mentioned poultry in particular. I don't know if Brazil is necessarily sort of selling poultry at an unfair low price or not. The fact that prices are low does not necessarily reflect the fact that prices are unfair. We have to be clear on that. They may be lower than ours, but clearly we're talking about places where it's sort of, let's say, for example, agricultural labor tends to be relatively cheaper. But here's the only point I'll say, that when we lose market share, right, as we compete, but when we lose market share, that it's a very different thing to lose market share in the context of trade tensions versus losing market share in the context of free and fair competition. And I think right now, one of the things that sort of concerns me is I think this increasing investment by the Chinese in Brazil is in part retaliation. And I don't know if this has now led to some structural change that we can't remedy. I'm not sure if China will sort of reverse this. I don't even know if this Chinese-Brazil relationship is sustainable, right? I don't know. And we don't get as much data out of ERS anymore from South America on cost of production issues. And someone mentioned that to me just here at this conference. And they're 100% correct that we need to once again and get more scientists and economists down there to try to understand sort of what's going on. But then the last thing I'll say is we do have a certain respect for the environment in the United States, and we have these global climate policies. And I do think encroachment on the Amazon for increasing agricultural production should in some way be reined in, right? I believe that 100%. Yeah.
We're right at the end of our time, but I do have one question for Ambassador Darcy. We have 3 different universities of students here today. What advice would you give them if some of them like to follow you one day, kind of a career path?
Forgot my clicker there. So first of all, just be curious. The fact that you're here today is a great start, right? Get out of the United States. I would say study abroad, go work abroad for a little bit, go see how our products are perceived, how the economics at household level and among businesses operate, if you want to think about that career in trade. But, you know, a lot of people will say to me, oh, you're a trade negotiator, you must be a lawyer. I am not a lawyer. And I would say, if you don't think you really want to practice law, don't pay for a law degree. Because we really need, I have a master's in public policy, and I focused it on environmental policy and on international relations because I was interested in environmental affairs and I was, you know, interested in what was happening in the rest of the world. I fed my curiosity. I had no interest in going in trade. I didn't know a trade career existed. But, you know, I went into federal service and found a temporary role that became my career. So I would just say, one, that strong, take some classes in economics. Think about the international context, get overseas if you can. If you're a scientist, we desperately need you, right? Especially those international standards. If you think about climate change in this and what it's doing to pest pressure and the movement of, pests and diseases and crops, agriculture is in for a big challenge, and we need science for that. And federal service needs all of those different skill sets and needs people who can speak that language. If you are a scientist who can put what you study in English so people understand what to do about it, you are golden. So remember that, how to tell the story of why what you're studying is important. But mostly say yes to things. So you're going to take a first job that is probably not your dream job, right? But it's going to be great experience. And if the job description doesn't look like quite what you wanted, but your manager is clearly interested in your growth, and you're going to be working with other people who do interesting things, go for it. And then the next time somebody gives you an opportunity that maybe it wasn't quite what you expected, but they have a plan for how to use your skills and develop you in a certain way, say yes to that. I went to USTR on a 6-month assignment to help write an environmental review of the US-Chile trade agreement. After that 6 months, I was asked to stay, and by the end of it, I was leading the negotiation of the environmental chapter of that trade agreement. And I stayed as a trade negotiator for 7 years, went on to work on the Hill, and then joined USDA and USTR. Had not any sense that that was a career path I could have. So I would just say keep a very open mind, stay curious. We live in a world where all of these disciplines are complex and interconnected, and you just don't know where it might take you. So good luck to you.
Thank you so much for that answer, and thank you both. This has been an outstanding discussion, and I appreciate your time and attention and the attention to the details. Let's give them a warm hand. Janet has asked me, we're going to take about a 10-minute break before Deputy Secretary Vaden comes back in. It's going to be our keynote speaker. So I think we got some refreshments and goodies outside. So we'll see you all in about 10 minutes. Thank you so much.
directors for the Winthrop Rockefeller Institute. On a regular basis. He was appointed to the position of Vice President for Agriculture for the University of Arkansas System on July 1st, 2022. And as Vice President, he is responsible for leading the university system's coordinated agriculture program, including the Cooperative Extension Service and the Agriculture Experiment Station. With almost 1,200 employees, the division has faculty and facilities located across the state, including presence in all 75 counties. The division has a unique mission of serving the statewide agriculture community in Arkansas. And Dr. Fields has had a number of roles in academic research and leadership prior to coming to Arkansas. In fact, he said I could introduce him just as a country boy from Louisiana, but I'm not going to do that because you belong to Arkansas now. Dr. Fields, we appreciate what you all do at Extension. It is such an important presence in our community. So thank you for what you do and welcome.
Thank you, Janet, for that introduction. And I am a country boy from Louisiana who's in Arkansas now, so Razorback all the way. But also want to take a minute to thank Janet and her staff for hosting us and for the hospitality that they've shown and everything that they've done to pull this lecture series together. So I'd like to give them a round of applause. Also want to say thank you to the Winthrop Rockefeller Distinguished Lecture Series Committee for making it possible for the University of Arkansas system to bring renowned experts in their field to Arkansas for the purpose of stimulating public discussion and intellectual debate. So really appreciate the work that you all have done to bring this group together to have a discussion about an extremely important topic. Also want to thank all of our guests who are here. We have from students to our policymakers, agricultural leaders, farmers, all who have shown an interest in this topic. We really appreciate you taking the time out to be here to make the lecture series what it is today. So from my perspective as a land-grant institution, our goal is to conduct non-biased, science-based research that will also allow us to inform decision makers and policymakers with the tools that they need to make informed decisions. So today we've already heard some exciting discussion or some outstanding insights from our panelists. So I want to thank Dr. Muhammad and Ambassador Vaden for their insights that we've had so far. Really excited to hear more about this overall topic of trade. And we know why trade is important. So in Arkansas, we understand that our farmers are in an amazing crisis right now, unprecedented financial crisis. Skyrocketing input costs are a big part of that. Also, record low commodity prices have been what we've experienced. Arkansas has been deemed kind of ground zero for this overall farm crisis. When we think about that, agricultural trade is part of the demand side that helps us to build a demand that helps to facilitate higher prices for our overall agricultural commodities. So with that, I'm very excited for our next speaker, Judge Stephen Alexander Vaden. He was appointed to be the Deputy Secretary of the United States Department of Agriculture on July 7th, 2025. Alongside Secretary Brooke Rollins, Deputy Secretary Vaden leads the department's operations and implements policies that support America's food and farm systems. He's a native of Union City, Tennessee. Deputy Secretary Vaden brings expertise in agricultural policy, law, and rural development. Previously, he served as a judge on the U.S. Court of International Trade and as general counsel for USDA. Throughout Deputy Secretary Vaden's time as general counsel, he led successful Supreme Court litigation, advanced regulatory reform, and supported the implementation of the 2018 Farm Bill. He's a graduate of Yale Law School and Vanderbilt University. A public servant with strong agricultural roots, Deputy Secretary Vaden is committed to revitalizing rural America and ensuring an abundant, affordable, and safe U.S. food supply. Please join me in welcoming Secretary Vaden.
Well, thank you all. It is wonderful to be here this morning in Arkansas, and I know we have many students in the room from at least 3 universities, and so I want to tell them and make certain they understand how lucky they are to be able to study in the state of Arkansas, because as part of your University of Arkansas, you have the National Agricultural Law Center. And I hope that you realize what an important resource the National Agricultural Law Center is, not just for those who practice law and represent farmers day to day, but for policymakers in Washington, D.C., because it is a source that everyone can go to in order to make certain, at a bare minimum, we have our facts straight about the current state of ag policy and the debates that are shaping ag policy today. We have long known that at the United States Department of Agriculture. When I was general counsel in the president's first term, I know both our lawyers and I referred to the website all the time. But in term 2, as ag issues have only risen in prominence and we begin to care about issues like what foreign countries own our land, and what states are doing in response to ensure that we know who owns our land and that they are friendly to our interests. It is to websites like those run by the National Agricultural Law Center that not just USDA, but White House officials turn to, so that we know that we have our facts straight and what the current state of the policy debate is. So you are very fortunate to be going to school in a state that puts substantial resources behind something that not only helps the people of Arkansas, but truly contributes to the national debate in a positive way on the issues that everyone gathered in this room cares about. So I want to thank the University of Arkansas for all of the funds they put behind the National Agricultural Law Center, and we look forward to many years of fruitful partnership down the road as our relationship serves to only grow. I am, of course, here today to talk to you a little bit about trade. And so when looking at how trade affects Arkansas farmers, I think when we look at 2 of the 3 major commodities that come out of this state, there are lessons that can be drawn for the policy debates that we are now facing. I also think that it's important that we step back a moment and take a look at the overall trade policy debate. Whatever one's views on the current trade policies, it's important to know that you cannot beat something with nothing. And what I want to suggest to you is that when we look through that door past the talking points into what was done previously with regard to agricultural trade and policy, that is unfortunately what we were experiencing. Nothing. And the fruits of that are being borne today with the declining commodity prices and the declining market access that we have had and that this administration is seeking to rectify. As was mentioned by the previous speakers, Arkansas is #1 in rice. That is not a new phenomenon. You have been the largest producer of rice in this country for more than 5 decades. And the United States exports, depending on the year, 40 to 45% of its rice crop every year. Our markets for rice are mainly in Mexico, Central America, South America, the Middle East, as well as shipping smaller volumes to places like the European Union and sub-Saharan Africa. But as the people of Arkansas know quite well, the international market situation for rice has only grown more difficult in the past years, and rice is now one of the most distressed commodities, particularly when one factors in that rice has the highest cost of production in regard to any of our large commodity crops here in the United States. It faces increasing competition, including from South America, and it has to deal with the fact that India is a nation that, while frequently claiming to wish to hold back large amounts to ensure adequate domestic supply, somehow large portions of what it holds back tend to make their way to the international market, and unfairly compete against American agricultural producers. Indeed, just yesterday, this administration filed a formal notice with the World Trade Organization to protest the Indian government's own calculation of how it has been managing its agricultural markets, including in rice. In other words, we are trying to demonstrate through formal processes and international systems that the Indians' numbers just don't add up, and that if added up properly, they demonstrate that they are violating the rules to which we have all supposedly agreed. Rice is also unique in the sense that the problems that it faces from foreign competitors are exactly the types of harms that traditional trade practices and remedies are designed to ameliorate. That is to say, when an American grower of rice is competing against a foreign grower who is subsidized, and then that subsidized rice is dumped onto the American market to compete with American rice, those are exactly the situations where tariffs and countervailing duties can work. Despite being a large rice producer, we have seen over the past 5 years an increase in the amount of Americans' rice consumption that is met by foreign imports. But I am happy to say that the tide is beginning to turn thanks to the change in trade policies. We expect for the current marketing year, which began in August of last year and will continue until July of this year, for the first time in 5 years, there will be a net decline in imports into the United States of foreign rice. That is just a beginning, however. We need to take into account the harms that foreign countries are doing by dumping rice into the United States. That is why I am so happy that our United States Trade Representative, Jamison Greer, has publicly announced on multiple occasions that it is his intention to commence a so-called Section 301 investigation into the rice market. Section 301 is a statutory tool that gives the president broad authority to remedy unfair foreign trade practices. This is exactly what American rice farmers have been facing, and I look forward to the Department of Agriculture providing the Trade Representative's Office with all the data we have at our disposal in order so the Trade Representative can get an adequate picture of the harms to America's rice farmers, and this administration can begin to craft remedies which will seek to put American rice farmers on an even playing field with their foreign competitors, really for the first time in many years. So that is something to look forward to as this year continues. The second large commodity crop here in Arkansas is cotton. Arkansas, as was noted in the earlier panel, is the third largest producer of cotton. And we here in the United States only use 10 to 15% of the cotton that we grow here for domestic consumption. That is to say, nearly all of it is exported overseas. In fiscal year 2025, our exports totaled $4.9 billion, with our top export markets being Vietnam, Pakistan, and Turkey, among others. There is stiff foreign competition as well in cotton, especially from Brazil. Despite that, if you look at the total trade numbers over the previous 5 years, the United States accounted for 30% of world trade in cotton, managing to fend off our largest competitors, Brazil, which represented 26% of world trade in cotton, and Australia at 12%. But U.S. cotton production has never fully recovered from the 2008 financial crisis, which saw cotton production decline by 50% and substantial mill closures across this country. Indeed, today, at this point, nearly 20 years later, our total current cotton output has only reached 2/3 of that we had before the 2008 financial crisis. And I want to suggest to you that there are at least two causes to that situation. First is consumer choice. we have seen a rapid increase in adoption of synthetic fibers. More and more of what the consumer chooses to wear is not a natural fiber. Now, what's interesting is that this trend is coming at a time when there is supposedly more interest from the consumer about from where their product comes and the long-term implications of purchasing decisions that consumers made. To take the fancy language out of it, this is a natural fiber jacket that I'm wearing. It's wool. If I were to bury it out there in the ground, come back many years from now, or someone else did, the only thing that would be left of this piece of clothing are the buttons. That would be the only evidence that there was ever a jacket put there. Same would be for any cotton piece of clothing. You take a 100% cotton denim pair of jeans, you're just going to find the rivets in the zipper. That's going to be it. It's not going to be there. Now you think about the synthetic fibers that so many of us wear, which have as their background all too frequently petroleum products. The stretchy pants that so many people go to the grocery store or the airport on. The sad fact, despite the Transportation Secretary's disdain for it, the sad fact of the matter is that if you take that so-called athleisure wear and you bury that outside and you come back many hundreds of years from now, it'll be dirty as heck, but it'll still be there. And it will still be there for many, many years after that. I'm grateful that the U.S. Cotton Council is beginning to put this choice before consumers of what it is they truly want to be wearing. They're calling it plant versus plastic. But I call it, do you actually live up to the values you claim to preach? And when it comes to so much of our trade policy, that is a question that we in the United States need to put to the rest of the world. Because I fundamentally believe that if the rest of the world, and in particular those countries which are on our level of development in both East Asia and the European Union, were truly living up to the commitments that they seek to tout, America would be their number one source for agricultural commodities, and it sure as heck wouldn't be Brazil. But cotton is also a cautionary tale because it tells us the problems that we face if we become overly dependent on any one country in world trade. Here, I am talking, of course, about China. Much of the clothing that we wear, synthetic or natural fiber, is manufactured in China. Historically, China has depended on imports for the vast majority of the cotton and other fibers that it needs to manufacture clothing. The United States has long been a principal source of that cotton. With the rise of Brazil, Brazil ate into that market share. But in recent years, something very interesting has happened. What I want to suggest to you is what has happened with cotton is not an accident. It's part of a plan. And if we allow those in the news media and elsewhere who only know about one or two commodities and apparently are only aware of one country to which we can sell things overseas, we run the risk of having multiple of our commodities being in the same tough situation that cotton is because of overdependence on only one market. The Chinese now grow a plurality of the cotton that their own domestic clothing industry uses. They need fewer imports not only from the United States, but also from Brazil. They're using their own domestic cotton production in the clothes that we wear. This is a problem for the entire international market. But this is not an accident of history. The Chinese government has been very open in their public statements that they view their dependence on imports for agricultural commodities from any country as a national security risk of the first order. Little wonder, whether you're talking about the United States or whether you're talking about Brazil, in order to get those commodities to China, learned in the event of conflict, you are not altogether likely to see those boats reach their final destination. It is a weakness of the Chinese system that they depend on these imports, and they are keen to cut it. They have done so with cotton, and they've got plans to do so with other major commodities like soy and corn. Indeed, currently, the Chinese government has what would amount to in American dollars a massive subsidy for anyone, particularly in northeastern China, that wants to grow soybeans. And they are working with their neighbors across their northern border in the far east of Russia, where they do have soybean production and indeed facilities to process soybeans to near shore additional amounts of consumption. When you have a government like the Chinese government that does not have to worry about 4-year election cycles, and a country that values the long term over the short term as a matter of cultural perspective, you can see that with leadership from the top and a laser-like focus on reducing what they see as their critical liabilities with regard to their national security, over time, China is quite likely to become a significant producer of many of the crops that they currently import. So if we focus all of our attention on how much we can sell to that one country, large as a market as though it currently is, we are ultimately contributing to the mistake that the Chinese are working on their end to cut back on. That is to say, we are putting ourselves at their mercy and allowing them to turn the ratchet against us should tensions unfortunately inflame themselves over the coming years. This is why when it comes to this administration's trade policy, and when I go out and talk about the different agreements and frameworks that are being reached, I will always mention China. It is a very large market currently. It's too large not to mention. But I will try to spend as much time, if not more, talking about the agreements that this administration has reached with other Southeast Asian partners, with our own hemispheric partners here in the Western Hemisphere, and indeed the European Union. For American agriculture to have a firm footing going into the future, we need increased demand. It's just that simple. This is a supply and demand equation. Trade is an extremely important part of that equation, and we have to be doing more of it with more parts of the world. The other part of that equation, not necessarily for today's speech, is about domestic consumption. And there I think it is no secret that biofuels is the key to unlocking not only greater domestic consumption of American agricultural products, but also greater energy security for the United States. Because if we can say, with regard to all of the liquid fuels that we use, in not just our automobiles, but also looking toward the future in our maritime vessels as well as our airplanes, that the fuels that go into those tanks were either drilled or grown here in the United States, then we will have truly reached energy independence and can spend far less time worrying about international conflicts in energy producing countries. But taking all of that into play, one thing that I want you to take away from this is, whatever your view on the current administration's trade policy, I want to suggest to you, as I said at the beginning, that you can't beat something with nothing. What do I mean by that? Well, let me take you back in recent history to a couple of key dates on the calendar and remind you of where we were on those different dates with regard to trade policy. First, I want to take you back to the 19th of January, 2021. That was the last full day in office for President Trump's first term. on that date, we had active trade negotiations with, among other countries, Japan, the United Kingdom, Kenya, and India. There were prospects for reaching agreement, and there was desire on both sides to continue the discussions. That's where things stood on the 19th of January 2021. I could go deeper, talk about the new United States-Mexico-Canada agreement, other agreements that had been made. You get the point. Let's move forward 4 more years. January 19th, 2025. That was President Biden's last full day in office. What was the status of our trade policies on that day? Starkly different. It was the official policy of the United States government for the prior 4 years that the United States government would not enter into any new trade agreement with any foreign country. Even countries that wanted aggressively to enter into agreements with us on a voluntary basis. I'll pick the United Kingdom as the most clear example. We held out the hand like the Heisman Trophy. We weren't interested in having that conversation. It reached peak cuteness, in my opinion, when the United States Trade Representative's Office, under the prior administration, actually redefined what a trade agreement was on its own website. Previously, there had been no misunderstanding about what a trade agreement was. The two sides reach agreement. We both open sectors of our market greater to each other's products, and hopefully there's a reciprocal nature so that we can both go home to our different countries' constituencies and say we have both benefited. That is what everyone understood a trade agreement to be. Previous administration, because they had an express policy of no new trade agreements, they juxtaposed on the trade representative's website something that they redefined as traditional trade agreements. That is to say, trade agreements that heretofore everyone understood what the term means. And then they had their own category of trade agreements, which were, from my perspective, I'm certain they would disagree with this, were more documents about feelings and values as opposed to actually opening up any new market for agriculture or anyone else for that matter. And so you had 4 years of stasis. Now, I frequently hear critics of the president's trade policy calling for the need for stability. I very much respect that. Business needs to know what the rules are in order to be able to make long-term investment decisions. The problem, however, with focusing solely on stability is that, in some ways, doing nothing, well, that's stable. There are no policy changes. We just continue on as we were, with no effort to change and no actual change whatsoever. The problem with that unthinking stability is that the agricultural market, like any other market, is dynamic. It is always changing. And I don't care whether you're talking about agriculture, whether you're talking about information technology, whether you're talking about manufacturing, or whatever sector of the economy you wish. If you go on a 4-year vacation and you do nothing, when you come back from that vacation, your balance sheet is going to be in bad shape. That is exactly what American agriculture found itself in on the 19th of January, 2025. And then you add on top of that the last farm bill that was enacted is the 2018 Farm Bill. We're still talking today about marking up a new farm bill. I'm glad to see Chairman G.T. Thompson has done so. I'm glad to see this state's senior senator, Senator Bozeman, has committed to marking one up in the Senate. I think that is long overdue. But it goes to my point about an unthinking stability. You had very stable farm policy from 2018 to January of 2025. Nothing changed in terms of the law, in terms of production agriculture. You still had the same reference prices you always had. You still had the same crop insurance terms. No changes whatsoever were made to any of those. How did that play out for American agriculture? And that stability was detrimental, but it was also an exception. Because when I look at policy, let's go back to what many political scientists say is the dawn of the modern American government, with all its pluses and minuses. 1933, the ascension of Franklin Delano Roosevelt, nearly 100 years from today. Every American president, regardless of political party, who served at least one complete term in office, a full term of 4 years, starting in 1933 until the present, except for one, can say the same thing. I signed a farm bill. The one that can't is the immediately preceding president, Joe Biden. So at a time when our trade policy was literally this, we also had no changes in our domestic policy for American agriculture to reflect the incredibly dynamic situation that our farmers were dealing with. Skyrocketing inflation, increasing global competition, and while we may have been on the sidelines and not participating in trade discussions by choice, as this room knows all too well, our competitors, especially in Brazil, they weren't on vacation. They were hard at work, stealing our market share, and the European Union was busy trying to negotiate as many new agreements as possible that included geographic indicators, laser focused on blocking American farmers and other producers from being able to compete in foreign countries because we weren't allowed to call a spade a spade. We couldn't say that the products that we make, which are of exactly the same type as what the Europeans make, they trademark those names. You can't call champagne, champagne. You can't call Parmesan, Parmesan, unless it comes from Italy. They blocked us out. So the foreign consumer, looking at an American product under a name that no one really understands, and a product from the European Union that has the common name that everyone, regardless of education level, understands, of course, they're going to pick the foreign product because they don't know what the heck it is we're trying to sell. That is the situation that we found ourselves in on the 20th of January, 2025, when President Trump came into office. It was as though we were seeking to run an Olympic race, but long after the starter had fired his pistol, we were still in the starting block, having been immobilized by our own policy decisions. That is unacceptable. So, whatever valid critiques there are, and I know there are some of this administration's trade policy, you cannot replace something with nothing. And I was incredibly disheartened to read a recent report from the esteemed ag journalist Wiesmeyer, who probably gets more into the raw data and filters out all of the partisan rancor of almost any ag reporter in this country, that he asked the what is question, the what if question. What if President Trump had lost the 2024 election? This administration was not in power. What would ag policy look like? What would ag trade policy look like? Mr. Wiesmeyer, after talking to many eminence Greases across Washington, D.C. and the rest of the country, came up with a very depressing answer. It would look like 4 more years of what we just had. Trade stasis, no changes in, you wouldn't have gotten the One Big Beautiful Bill Act, no markup in your reference prices, no changes to crop insurance. You would be exactly where you were on the 19th of January, 2025. Whatever the right solution to generate demand for American agriculture is, I can assure you it was not going on the 19th of January, 2025. And we cannot return there. Fortunately, although the news media doesn't focus on this, when we have these trade negotiations, we are not alone. All too often, because it makes for fun copy, the news media likes to portray it as the United States versus the rest of the world. In my role, I have the great honor and privilege of interacting with many of the countries that we want to be better trading partners of ours. During my tenure of office, short though it may be so far, I have had meetings with everyone from the New Zealand trade minister to the president of Uzbekistan, to the trade ministers of Vietnam, to the 27 ambassadors just last week of the European Union. In all of these conversations, held behind closed doors without news media, I think most people would be surprised on how many points of agreement there are between the countries of the world that are truly interested in fair trade. For example, in any discussion of the United States-Mexico-Canada agreement, one of the first things that comes up with regard not just to American agriculture, but in regard to the entire agreement itself, is Canada's restrictive dairy management system, which locks out United States dairymen from being able to access the Canadian market. We have filed a case using the arbitration process laid out in the United States-Mexico-Canada agreement against Canada. We won that case. Nothing has changed. Not only that, just a couple of weeks ago, sometimes the most amazing statements are those that are made publicly. The head of the Canadian Dairy Association told Politico's Morning Ag, when it proffered the question, are you interested in selling more of your Canadian dairy products overseas? You know what the head of the Canadian Dairy Association's answer to that question was? No, we're not. We've got our monopoly here in Canada. We're suited with that. That suits our needs just fine. Can you think of any American actor, whether it be in agriculture, manufacturing, information technology, what have you, that if asked the question, would you like to sell more of what you produce to a larger share of the world, would answer no? And yet that is what we are up against. And when I sat down with those 27 ambassadors to the European Union, just like when I sat down to the trade minister of New Zealand, and I brought up the Canadian dairy system, every head in that room, regardless of from which country it came, nodded. They get it. They don't like it either. The French think their dairy products are wonderful. They would like to sell them in Canada too. They cannot do so because of the restrictive Canadian import control system. We have friends when we go into these rooms. I mentioned a moment ago about India. Obviously, we have huge issues with India across the board. It has one of the most restrictive import regimes of any nation in the world, and that has particular impacts here in Arkansas. Here's the thing. Arkansas farmers have allies in Southeast Asia. Southeast Asian countries, like Arkansas farmers, want to have a fair chance to compete in the Indian rice market. None of us do. And yet, when we sat down in a room with the Vietnamese, for example, that's an issue that was top of mind for them. These nations may not be willing to go out like the United States is and throw the first punch, as it were, in trade negotiations. But they are more than happy to serve as a chorus coming behind us in the slipstream to let us know that we're on the right track. We're not just out there seeking a market to benefit only Americans, although we strongly believe that a fair trade system will benefit the American farmer. We've got allies who don't have the ability or who may not have the political wherewithal to stand up for their producers who are urging us on when we have these private meetings. That, quite frankly, is what gives me both the most hope that things will change as we continue down this path, and validation that the moves that we are making are correct. We're not just going out, as the news media would have some believe, as a bullying hegemon only interested in our own interests. What we're interested in is fair competition, because I strongly believe that if you put American Parmesan cheese next to its Italian counterpart, I bet the American dairyman is going to get more than a fair share of the pie when he's allowed to compete fairly and can call his product indeed what it is. That's why I'm grateful that for the first time in really 20 years, we're having some effect with regard to the European Union. We have seen country after country, including critical markets like Indonesia, which has more than 200 million people scattered among its thousands of islands. They agreed to drop their agreement with the European Union. We can call champagne, champagne in Indonesia. We can call Parmesan, Parmesan in Indonesia. We can compete fairly. And equally as important for Arkansas, they're going to buy 163,000 metric tons of cotton for each of the next 5 years. And they have committed that in the event no new agreement is reached to supersede it, that in perpetuity after that, they will purchase an additional 150,000 metric tons of cotton from the United States. Because when it comes down to it, the problem with an agreement, whether it's multilateral or whether it's bilateral, is how can we judge whether or not the agreement is a success? And how can we know if we have a right to complain that it's not being met? There's only one way you can do that. That's by having unmistakably clear metrics. That's why every trade agreement this administration has reached has had at least two characteristics. Number one, it doesn't matter how small or how large the country, there is something in there opening up a new market for American agriculture. Because whether it's Secretary Brooke Rollins, Secretary of the Treasury Bessent, or Ambassador Greer, they all are on the same page. If you are unwilling to open your market more broadly to American agricultural products, you must not be interested in engaging in a new trade agreement, and we will not reach one with you. And then number two, it's got to have metrics you can test. We can't have weasel works. We can't say you'll greatly increase your purchase of whatever. You don't even have to be a lawyer to drive a truck through that. But 163,000 metric tons of cotton to Indonesia a year? Oh, we can measure that quite easily. Just like with the Chinese agreement on soybeans. We knew when they met it. We know they have met it. And if a future country decides to make the mistake of not meeting its agreement, we can take actions to bring them back into agreement with what they have supposedly come to an agreement with us on. That, I think, is the beginning of taking into account an America First trade policy, which, while benefiting the American farmer, has side benefits for those who wish for their own farmers to be able to compete in a truly fair international marketplace. Now, I want to take a moment to respond to some of the comments that were made about the trade deficit. I agree that the trade deficit number itself can become distracting. But I disagree that the trade deficit, particularly with regard to agriculture, is something that we shouldn't pay that close attention to. Why do I say that? Well, first, until about 4 years ago, we didn't have a trade deficit. We had more than 50 years of basically consistent agricultural trade surpluses. Even as we faced greater competition and greater cost of production pressures from overseas, we still managed to export more than we import. And that was at a time that for the rest of the American economy, that is truly an anomaly. We had trade deficits, excluding the service sector, as far as the eyes can see. The fact that this turned to a structural deficit, as I would call it, is so recent is an indication that maybe the trade deficit and the fact that we have one is trying to tell us something. But we also make a mistake if we pretend that trade is in a silo. This is one of my greatest critiques of lawyers, but it affects so many other policy areas. People declare themselves, well, I'm a trade lawyer, or I'm a trade policy expert. Or, I'm a labor lawyer, I'm a labor policy expert. Those silos don't exist in the real economy. The actions that the different sectors of the economy take, they affect all the other sectors of the economy. And if you think otherwise, you're kidding yourself. Let's turn to our agricultural trade deficit for a moment. What is the largest contributor to our trade deficit, particularly on a per capita, that is per unit produced basis? It's specialty crops, because they have the highest value per unit produced. Now, I can point to non-trade related cultural things that would partly explain why we have an increasing amount of imports into this country of specialty crops compared to previous generations. Most notably, fewer and fewer Americans accept seasonality with regard to the fruits and vegetables they produce. Everyone used to understand, well, you can't grow certain things in the winter. Now the consumer doesn't expect that. We have winter here in the United States. Therefore, if you wish to have certain of these commodities, they're going to have to come from somewhere that's not here. That's true, but it gets us off the hook for certain other wrong-headed decisions we may have made in the past. Because at a time when we have an increasing focus on health in this country in regard to what we are eating, we have made policy decisions in the past that disincentivize the production of specialty crops in this country. What am I talking about? I'm talking about labor policy. We have a wage rate called the adverse effect wage rate. It is effectively a super minimum wage for legal labor that comes into this country through the H-2A program. Migrant workers who legally get visas through our immigration process and come here on a seasonal basis to pick the fruits and vegetables that we all enjoy every day. That is the largest part of the cost of production for any specialty crop producer. What did the previous administration propose and put into law? They jacked the adverse effect wage rate up at a time of inflation that hadn't been seen for more than 40 years. And they did so by doing things like, if a farm worker happened to one day a week drive a truck on the farm to help out with the operation for a couple of hours in that day, all of a sudden he's no longer a farm worker, he's a truck driver, needs to be paid as such. When you increase the cost of production of any good, doesn't matter what it is, agricultural or otherwise, you are disincentivizing the production of that good domestically. And when the product that you are driving up the cost of production on through regulatory policy happens to be the product that contributes the greatest amount to the trade deficit, you are setting yourself on a path to never being out of deficit. So while I would agree that the deficit number can't be a be-all, end-all talisman, it nonetheless is an important factor that we can't help but take notice of to see whether we are taking wise policy actions that either incentivize the greater production of agricultural commodities here in the United States that are consumed here, or disincentivize the production, which necessarily means somebody else is going to grow what we eat and ship it here to the detriment of our local producers. And to put a bow on that story, that is why this administration has put into place a new adverse effect wage rule, which undoes those prior harms and takes into account basic economics. That is to say, the Internal Revenue Service has a term for a service that you would otherwise pay for yourself that someone else pays for. It's called income, and they tax it. And yet, in our adverse effect wage rate calculation, until now, it has not taken account of the fact that under federal law, for every legal H-2A worker that comes into this country to pick crops, the American farmer is required by statute to provide housing for that worker. If they hired a domestic worker, everyone in this room knows your employer isn't responsible for picking out your apartment for you. That's your job. You pay for it out of your own money as you see fit. But for the international worker, the farmer has a statutory obligation to provide that. That is income to that worker, and it should be taken into account as part of their overall salary. It is under the new adverse effect wage rule, which went into effect last year, and now we have a wage rate that, though not perfect by a long shot, better reflects the economic reality of the labor transaction that is occurring between the farmer and his legal worker, and removes part of that disincentive to produce more specialty crops in this country, which should have a positive effect on the trade deficit because we will need fewer imports from overseas. This is just one example of how all of these different policies, which if you were to read about in the popular press, might not be categorized as a trade policy. It would be labor policy. It might be union policy. It might be agricultural policy. But it is definitely trade policy, because whether you make something more expensive or less expensive to produce in the United States, you are going to have an impact on trade. And it is exactly these types of conversations that I am proud to be a part of, because even in our own administration, sometimes you have to let people know that they're not playing in a sandbox. They're playing in the ocean. And what everyone does has an effect on everyone else. Finally, before we get to questions, I just want to state a moment about what we are doing at the United States Department of Agriculture to help create new markets for producers overseas. Obviously, we are providing Ambassador Greer, Secretary Bessent, Secretary Lutnick with all the data they might need as they enter into each new trade negotiation with new countries in terms of what they're currently buying from us, what they're currently buying from our competitors, what we think about in terms of what they should be buying more from us. But using the authorities that Congress has granted to the Department of Agriculture, we have a series of trade missions on the agenda for this year, which is going to take us to places as diverse as the Philippines, Turkey, Australia, Saudi Arabia, and Vietnam. Our state partners, including here in Arkansas, will be important parts of these trade missions, because when we go overseas, we don't just bring government officials from the federal government. We bring our wonderful state ag commissioners like Wes Ward. We bring our commodity associations like USA Rice, like the Cotton Council, like the American Soybean Association, like the National Corn Growers Association, like our wonderful biofuels groups. They're literally on the plane with us as we go. I should emphasize, for taxpayers' purposes, a commercial flight, not a government flight. They are on the commercial flight with us as we go overseas in order to introduce these foreign markets to what we have to offer, and in order to see to it that we can help build those relationships which will lead to long-lasting gains. And one of the things that I am most excited about these missions are the increasing focus on biofuels internationally. That will be my final point. With regard to biofuels, more and more of the world are coming to the same conclusion that we came to more than 2 decades ago. That biofuels are a viable option, not just to power the modern economy, not just to help ensure we have cleaner air so we can lead healthier lives, but also to see to it that we can provide energy at a cost that is less than the historical petroleum-based sources of energy on which we all depend. At a time when the price of gasoline is very much on everyone's mind, it's important to note that a gallon of ethanol today sells for more than 80 cents a gallon less than a gallon of refined gasoline. That is the reason why when perhaps you turned off on exit, I believe it's 108 or 109, the Morrilton exit, to come here today, you may have passed that Casey's convenience store. If you didn't take a look at the price that they had up on the digital display when you came here today, when you leave later this afternoon or evening, I encourage you to take a glance at that sign. Because like every Casey's convenience store that I'm aware of, they put up there the price of traditional unleaded gasoline, 87 octane, that has 10% ethanol. Right beside it, they put up an alternative that has an increased amount of ethanol in it, and therefore higher octane, 88 or 89, and it never fails that higher octane, but yet lowest grade of gasoline is cheaper per gallon than the equivalent with lesser ethanol. Whatever else certain people want to tell you about what the renewable volume obligation does to the price of gas, Casey's isn't selling the higher ethanol content gas for less to make a political point. Political points don't show to your stockholders. They're doing it because it reflects the economic reality that biofuels are cheaper. More and more countries are coming on board to that. This summer, Vietnam will institute E10. They're going to buy that ethanol from us. And when they create their own facilities, as the trade minister told me a few weeks ago, to produce ethanol in Vietnam, they're still going to need the corn to feed those plants, and they want American farmers to be the provider of it. We currently have E10 in this country too. Surely we can beat Vietnam and come up with at least E15. But here's the part where looking internationally helps us. Even when we reach E15, when Congress passes the legislation as President Trump has requested, we're still not an international leader in biofuels. Go look south of the border. Go look down to Brazil. They've got E20. Nearly every gas station they've got. And in some of their gas stations, they have E99. Japan, they're about to require synthetic or sustainable, whatever your favorite S is, aviation fuel in their jets. The European Union is about to do the same. America needs to jump on board this train, increase adoption of biofuels, and the discussions that we will have both with regard to trade and with regard to domestic consumption in this country will be much happier conversations because we will have permanently lifted the demand curve, which will solve many of the issues that we are currently having in modern American agriculture, both trade and otherwise. So on that optimistic note, I'll close out and look forward to your questions. Thank you so very much.
I just wanted to say thank you to the Rockefeller Institute for having this. This is the first time that I've participated in this, so I greatly have got a lot of benefit out of it. And thank you, Judge Vaden, for your comments, particularly around the long play versus only the 4-year terms that we have in the U.S. My question is, Arkansas farmers are very good at what we do. Matter of fact, we are blessed to be in a country and in a state where we have access to be able to support. We have the natural infrastructure of the river, we have the highway systems. The question I was looking at, I had the opportunity to go on a fact-finding mission to our neighbors to the south of Florida to promote Arkansas poultry and rice. And understanding the geopolitical terms of what we were doing down there in late October versus what's happening today help me understand a little bit of where the administration is going through this geopolitical, but also understanding that long-term of the other trade partners that we have. But it looks like we have an opportunity south of our Florida border, but yet understanding the conflicts, the barriers that we have. Can you kind of enlighten what you all are looking at for long-term and short-term, and see if that is a partner that we can be able to use Arkansas products in?
So I agree with your point entirely. Cuba represents a gigantic untapped market for American agriculture for so many commodities, rice being chief among them. Currently, we have approximately $16 million in rice exports to Cuba. And if Cuba were a free market economy led by a democratic regime, we would be able to ship them not only a whole lot more rice, but so much of what we produce in this country. You don't have to take my word for it. You can just go back and look at the relationship that the United States had with the island of Cuba prior to the rise of the communist regime there. Go back to the 1950s and see about the wonderful symbiotic relationship between the United States and Cuba, and what a wonderful partnership not only our countries had, but our peoples had, as there was basically an easy exchange with regard to tourism, economic development, and so many other things between the United States and that wonderful island that has been destroyed by its government over the past 70 years. If there's one thing that has become plain to me, particularly over the past 12 months, it is that increasingly the time for autocratic regimes is running out. And with regard to Cuba, they find themselves with, at this point, basically no friends in the world. Russia is not in a position to subsidize them. Their friends in Venezuela have fallen and have left them by the wayside and are no longer providing essentially free oil on a barter system in exchange to keep the Cuban economy running. The Chinese government, as so many autocratic governments have found out over the past few months, isn't going to lift a finger when push comes to shove to save anybody. And so the only question that I have about Cuba is when the transition will take place, not whether the transition will take place. And we stand ready at the Department of Agriculture when freedom finally reigns for the Cuban people to help open that market up. And we want the American farmer's hand to be among the first outstretched to that island. So I don't have any specifics for you on a timeline, but what I can say is that I am more confident than ever that that regime's days are numbered. It will be a good day for the Cuban people when that regime falls, and it will be a good day for the American farmer when we can return to the bilateral relationship we had 7 decades ago of friendship and partnership when it comes to exchanging what both of our countries in regard to agriculture do best.
Deputy Secretary Vaden, thank you for being back in Arkansas, and thank you for giving up your lifetime appointment to the U.S. Court of International Trade to take on this opportunity. My question is about the U.S.-Taiwan deal recently. One important aspect for the poultry industry is the regionalization aspect of that trade agreement. It was a unique, novel opportunity to not make it state-by-state regionalization, but all the way to the county level. You talk about certainty for the poultry industry and exports. That's a big opportunity. I thought I'd ask you if there are other potential opportunities to expand that regionalization in the future.
Thank you, Blake. Good to have you here, and I think that's a good question. That is something that I agree with you could be a game changer in the event the poultry industry finds itself subject to the whims of nature. And it means that should that happen, all American poultry growers don't find themselves locked out of the Taiwanese market. You have a country as large as ours, it makes common sense, but it hasn't found its way into that many of our trade agreements. That is one of the things that I think the bilateral and sometimes trilateral agreements that we're reaching with foreign countries give us the opportunity to do. They give us an opportunity to test out new provisions that we may not be able to sell at once to 20 plus countries, but that one country may be willing to take us up on. And then we can use that positive example when the provision comes into play to show our other trade partners how well this works for both sides. It addresses legitimate concerns the foreign country may have on the phytosanitary end, while ensuring that all the American producers don't get painted with the same broad brush. And as you know, Blake, with regard to poultry, we're trying to engage in a proactive effort there as we battle highly pathogenic avian influenza. There are vaccines that are working their way through and could be deployable. We also know, with regard to poultry, that some of our foreign trading partners, if those vaccines ended up having to be deployed, might shut their markets to all of American poultry, both the protein side and the egg side. We wouldn't want that to happen. Our Undersecretary for Marketing and Regulatory Programs, Dudley Hoskins, he's got a full plate, but one of the things he's focused on is having conversations with our trade partners now so that we can socialize possible solutions to problems that may be down the road to ensure that our farmers are not harmed by necessary steps the federal government may have to take. It's about talking before the problem reaches so that should the problem come, we're not caught flat-footed, as it were. That's another positive development, especially for the poultry sector. And I hope that that continues to form an example of what we do with regard to other ag sectors so that we do not find ourselves subject to what has happened under administrations of both parties in the past, where countries seek to take advantage of disease or some novel development with regard to a particular species and shut out the American farmer from being able to compete. I thank you for highlighting that particular provision.
For speaking today, and thank you again to the Rockefeller, Rockefeller Institute for, again, allowing us to have a complex conversation where we can actually discuss these things. Is there an alignment with the biofuel that you were talking about? Is there a time alignment with farm machinery, other equipment in the United States at this time?
Could you say a little more about what you mean by that?
Well, if you were promoting biofuels, is the United States ready for that? Both in farming equipment, I mean, you mentioned, airplanes, et cetera.
So with regard to the adoption of E15, we have all the corn that would be required for that and more. There would be no issue for that, even if, and we know it would take time for the equipment to get out there and for it to be adopted more broadly. But even if this year, for example, we would be able to have 15% ethanol across the board in every gasoline station across this country, we have enough production to cover that currently. With regard to maritime and sustainable or synthetic aviation fuel, that really represents a new horizon. Let's talk about maritime first. Maersk, the Scandinavian company, is one of the world's largest shipping fleet operators. Amazingly, it replaces 5% of its fleet of ships every year. That's quite a high shipbuilding rate. And according to the Maersk Shipping Company, every ship that it buys currently, every ship that it's ordering new, is capable of burning biofuel because they see that as the future. And since they are a European-based company, it may be mandated over there. The Japanese government has agreed to buy sustainable aviation fuel from us as part of the trade agreement that it has reached with this country. The Japanese government likewise is looking at the impact of all the many airlines that carry the many Japanese citizens, not only domestically but internationally. And they see sustainable aviation fuel as a way to reduce the impact of the gallons of fuel that are burned necessary to support modern aviation. Currently, in this country, we do not have a facility that produces sustainable aviation fuel at commercial quantities that we could sell to Japan. However, I am happy to say that as a result of that trade agreement, we have had one proposal, at least one proposal, come our way with two incredibly serious private sector backers, which I have reason to be greatly optimistic about, such that we may, in the not too distant future, have ground broken on a sustainable aviation fuel plant here in the United States that will not only have the backing of the private sector, but will also have the imprimatur of the United States government behind it, because one of the key first customers of that plant would, of course, be the people of Japan. They're having expressed a desire to buy the fuel from us in the first place. And I think that breaking ground on such a plant as that will lead to further private sector investment in a way that will build for American agriculture. When I look at the future of biofuel development in this country, I see this as a situation, one that I am most optimistic about. I think E15 is going to get there. It's frankly been much more of a struggle than it should have been. But when that EPA rule comes out, that I have said publicly, and I'm very comfortable saying publicly, will be the most pro-biofuels rule put in place by any administration of either party, that's going to begin the cascade. Because when you have that in place, some of the provisions in that rule become realities on the balance sheets of some of the very large refiners. They re-enter the conversation that currently has been dominated by small and medium-sized refiners, including one located in this state of Arkansas. That's going to be a very different political discussion when it's Valero versus a company nobody's ever heard of. That's going to bring those people to bear in a way that I think will help to move E15 through the Congress finally. And then, with the efforts that this administration is undertaking to improve biofuel adoption overseas and make certain that the biofuels that these countries buy come from the United States, that demand is going to make its way through the system. It's not a matter of hitting a home run with everything you do, to use a baseball analogy. We need a strong series of singles and doubles. And I see those coming through. Indeed, I mentioned earlier I met with the ambassadors from the European Union. I was very frank with them in a way. I know that they're in favor of biofuels, but some of the policy decisions that they are considering are quite frankly head-scratching. For example, it seems rather odd for a political entity to have as one of its brand indicators, as it were, sustainability and environmentalism, and yet they at times wish to disadvantage the American farmer, which truly has to be across commodity, one of the most sustainable operations known to man. We are not expanding our agricultural footprint in this country. We are losing, on average, 4,000 acres of farmland a day to development. Yet there are some political actors over there that wish to say, no, we shouldn't buy from the United States. But they'll buy the same exact product from Brazil, which is literally busy plowing through the Amazon rainforest in order to expand its agricultural footprint. Indeed, just a couple of weeks ago, we had an emergency reach out from an American corporation whose facility in Brazil had been taken over by angry residents of that country. They were indigenous peoples who were upset because the Brazilian Congress had passed another bill to streamline a highway through their ancestral lands in the Amazon rainforest and mow it down so that they could get more agricultural commodities to market. So what I asked those European Union ambassadors was essentially to put up or shut up. If you're going to talk about sustainability, maybe you shouldn't be buying from the only country in the world that I'm aware of that's knocking down rainforest in order to ship you more of what you want. Maybe you should buy here from the United States where that's not a problem. And while you do so, take advantage of the advice offered by our friends in Germany. Germans have been a wonderful partner with us on so many EU issues. Being a country that has a modern economy, that likes to export and is unafraid of competing on a fair playing field with anyone, whether it be agriculture, manufacturing, or what have you. They frequently serve as our voice in those European Union discussions internally that we don't get invited to. And they are with us 100%. I've met with the German agriculture minister. His first visit outside of the EU was to the United States. I've been to the German embassy several times. And every time we have these discussions, whether in public or private, they are with us because it is absolutely bonkers that the European Union is discussing a deforestation regulation which would drown American farmers in paperwork. And that is just the prospect of it is causing companies like Georgia Pacific, for example, to go around to southern landowners and ask them to sign a contract in effectively blood for every generation henceforth more that you will put trees back when they are harvested on their land, while the country that's actually doing the most to face deforestation faces not a single feather more regulatory headache than the American farmer or the German farmer, where that's not at all a concern. That's not a type of policy that one would implement if one truly wishes to be fair and reward good behavior. And this should not be tolerated by any administration of either party. To my mind, having these discussions frankly but politely is the first step toward letting them know we're going to hold you accountable when you say one thing out of your mouth and do another with the euros that you spend on agricultural commodities. And if we can get real about farming practices and what the American farmer does better than any other farmer in the world from my point of view, and constantly producing more and more from a smaller footprint thanks to the wonderfully advanced technologies that we have here, I have little doubt that the American farmer will be able to not just compete, but succeed in biofuels and everything else.
I was like, I don't care.
Judge Vaden, thank you so much.
Okay.
I'm Van Ryder, the president of Arkansas Farm Bureau. We have the privilege to represent every sector of agriculture in the state. And in my position as president, I'm also on the American Farm Bureau Board of Directors, where I serve on the Trade Commission. Unfortunately, you answered two of my questions right here in your last statement. but I've got a third one. Jameson Brewer came to talk to us a few months ago. And here in Arkansas, we've had terrible 3 years. We lead the nation last year in bankruptcies. We have farmers that are younger farmers that have very little equity. Every day they're saying we're going to call it quits. We have farm sales throughout the state at 2 to 3 a week sometimes. We have those that are doing the auctions having to schedule several weeks ahead in order to have those farm sales. It's the worst environment we've had in several years. We have crops that are 25 crops that are going on 24 crops in storage. We have some farmers that are building more grain bins because they don't have anywhere to sell their crops to. The question that we asked Jameson Greer, and I'm going to ask you the same thing. Every day my farmers are asking me, what do we do? Do we quit raising soybeans? Do we keep raising them? Do we find something else, or do we get out of business? So my question to you is, what do I tell my farmers? Do I tell them there's no future because we have Brazil that we're fighting against? Quite frankly, they raise 2 crops a year. It's tough for us to compete against that. And as you mentioned, they're knocking down a rainforest. We can't even clear out a wooded pasture field to make a crop out of it.
You have to watch out if there's a puddle in your field that somebody will declare to water of the United States. Yes,
Exactly.
I'm quite well aware of that.
So what do I tell my farmers?
I think you tell them to keep on keeping on because you've got an administration that's focused on these issues. I haven't mentioned it previously. Your question jogs my memory that with regard to Brazil, we're doing more than just talking about it. There's obvious hypocrisy going on there, but it also represents an unfair competition policy that Arkansas farmers, like farmers all across this country, have to deal with. farmers in this state, like the rest of the country, you steward your land. You don't have extra land that you can just reach out and take over. You understand that your most valuable asset is that land, and that if you degrade the quality of that land, you are slitting your own throat, business-wise. Brazil, it's not that way. They can reach out, take that degraded pasture land, convert it to cropland, and then, as noted, expand further into the rainforest by taking lands with the government's imprimatur that currently belong to others, including indigenous peoples that have been there for generations. That's not a situation that we can compete against. That's why I'm very glad that Jameson Greer, among his early actions, was to initiate a Section 301 investigation into Brazil. There were 3 items that were listed on the official notice of what he wanted to investigate. 2 of them were directly related to agriculture. First, ethanol, because they actually need additional ethanol in Brazil, given their higher biofuel adoption rate. Yet, American ethanol faces a much higher tariff in Brazil than Brazilian ethanol were it to be exported to the United States, that disincentivize and keeps us from being able to work into that market. Number 2, the deforestation point, which is essentially the rest of agriculture. We're not going to be mowing down ecologically important lands in order to expand our agricultural footprint. We have a hard enough time defending the footprint that we currently have and have had for generations. I am grateful that USA Rice, the National Cotton Council, the National Grain and Feed Association, among others, filed incredibly serious and thoughtful comments with the Trade Representative's Office that laid out exactly how these competition policies affect the American farmer, why it's difficult to compete against it, and laid out both tariff and non-tariff remedies that may help the American farmer to compete with their Brazilian counterpart and to disincentivize this behavior which should not be tolerated by anybody. I don't think that will solve everything, but by turning our attention to the problem and at least beginning to address it, that's the start of the solution. I recently asked our research, education, and economics a question that I wanted them to research for me. We all know the average age of the American farmer. He or she's on Social Security. 65. That's the average age of the American farmer. I wanted to know what the average age of the farmer in South America was. Go around, look at those different countries. They don't have Social Security down there, and if they did, they wouldn't be on it. And I'm very concerned about the transition to the next generation. I have experienced that myself. My father was of the World War II generation. He was born in 1918. He passed away in 2015. The farms that he owned in Kentucky and Tennessee, the Kentucky one having been in our family for 2 centuries, quite literally. It pre-exists the establishment of Fulton County by the Kentucky State Legislature. That's how long my family's owned that ground. I get how personal that is. And we have made it in the past with our tax and other regulatory decisions increasingly difficult to keep that land in production agriculture. There has been a heavy thumb on the scale in favor of selling the land for residential or commercial development or some other non-agricultural purpose. Part of that has been through wrong-headed tax policy, like the application of the estate tax to farmers. Frequently, people on the other side of that question say that no one pays the estate tax outside of Warren Buffett, Bill Gates, people like that. Well, I'm the nobody that they talk about because I've paid the estate tax. And though I know there are other positions on this issue, my own position is that I find it immoral. Anyone who thinks that the Internal Revenue Service ought to be an uninvited guest at your loved one's funeral. And that it should not be an issue. People should not have to do what my brother and I did following our father's death, where just after we buried him, we had to convene accountants, lawyers, and financial advisors to figure out how we were going to deal with the Internal Revenue Service and all the paperwork that we had to put together in order to keep the land and not to have to sell it. And we were very fortunate and able to do that, but that should not be a burden on the American farmer. And I'm glad to say that while the One Big Beautiful Bill Act did not completely eliminate the estate tax, it placed the lower limit of where that tax kicks in at such a high level, and equally as importantly, indexed it to inflation so that more and more people over time do not unwittingly find themselves subject to that immoral tax, such that for 99.9% of all estates, they will not have to pay the estate tax on the federal level going forward. Also tucked into the One Big Beautiful Bill Act, and a provision that I do not believe has gotten the attention that is due it, is a wonderful idea come up with by your counterparts at the Kentucky Farm Bureau, and that through the auspices of Senator Mitch McConnell, they were able to get a kernel of in the One Big Beautiful Bill Act. If you don't have a family member that wishes to take up the plow, but there's a young farmer of the next generation who wishes to buy your operation, when that young farmer buys your operation, you're subject to the same capital gains tax, which acts as a disincentive in order to encourage you to keep that land in production agriculture. In the One Big Beautiful Bill Act, there is a provision which begins to turn the tide against that disincentive. It provides you with limited tax relief if you instead choose to sell that land to that young farmer and he keeps it in production agriculture. You will pay less capital gains tax if you engage in that transaction than if you engage in the transaction that heretofore would have been preferred. You're selling it for development. Now, it's a beginning because the Congressional Budget Office took a look at what, in its opinion, the full tab of that would be for the American budget if we just said, if you sell to an American farmer the next generation and it stays in production agriculture, we're going to let you over time write off that tax liability. The answer for how much, according to the Congressional Budget Office, that would cost the Treasury was in the tens of billions of dollars. Given the math, in order to get the One Beautiful Bill Act across the finish line, that wasn't doable at this time. But we got that provision in there that begins the process and provides tax relief at a limited level. And my hope is that as we go back in future bills, whether it be this administration or a future administration, they will take that seed that the Kentucky Farm Bureau, your colleagues, wisely planted in the One Big Beautiful Bill Act and continue to water it so that we can expand the amount of tax relief over time that is provided, so that we provide every incentive to the American farmer to keep his or her land in production agriculture and ensure that the next generation is ready to take up the plow. And as long as we have thoughtful people like you and your colleagues in Farm Bureau bringing good policy ideas to us that keep American agriculture in the fight, as dark as the clouds may today seem, I have confidence that we will still be there taking care of this essential mission, because it is absolutely amazing that 2% of our population feeds all the rest. And not just all the rest of the United States, but a substantial portion of the world. The importance of agriculture is literally written in our language, although few people recognize it. When you have phrases that I know you all in Arkansas, particularly Blake, you know what the pecking order means and where that came from. That used to be common knowledge. But because of how divorced the vast majority of our people have come from how the food actually reaches their plate, there is an opportunity for both sides to sell a story. There's the fantasy story that's out there about how you can actually get food at an affordable price. And then there's the story that American agriculture not just knows, but practices every day. In that despite the inflation that we have seen over the previous years, Americans still spend less as a percent of their income feeding themselves than our European counterparts do. than our Japanese counterparts do. And there is a reason for that. That reason is sound policy, good stewardship, and not just an acceptance, but a welcoming of new technological developments that allow us to do so much more with the same amount or even less land. And so it's my belief that as long as we keep those policy fundamentals and don't allow people who have never visited a farm, much less understand how one works, guide our agricultural policy, the American farmer will end up winning the day. Thank you.
Continue this discussion all day, but we have regrettably run out of time for questions. We do, however, thanks to the Lecture Series, have lunch for everyone. I know that may be on your minds as well. As we conclude our program, I'd like to just do one more round of applause for Deputy Secretary Vaden, Dr. Muhammad. So as you exit the show barn here, you're going to go out the double doors at the back, and there are serving stations set up for you to, as we say in Arkansas, fix a plate. And so please help yourself to the lunch buffet. Dining will be just down the hall to your left. And so you'll take your